Past 8 o'clock hour, Chris Lenois back with you on the Green Mountain Mornings program. Joining me in the studio for the remainder of today's program is Mike Faher, the staff reporter for VTDigger. You can also find his writing in our two local publications, the Brattleboro Reformer online at reformer.com and the Commons online at commonsnews.org. Good morning to you, Mike.
Good morning.
Always appreciate you coming in here to talk about some of the stories that you've been covering in our community over the past week. Now, one story that was in the Reformer on Friday having to do with members of the Marlboro School Board going up to Montpelier to give testimony before a joint committee, or not a joint committee, but both committees, the House and Senate Education Committees, right, regarding the timing of Act 46, not feeling they have enough time to come up with a plan. Was it only Marlboro who was giving testimony here, or were there other school boards involved in this?
Well, that day, the reason I went up there was Marlboro was really sort of making the tour, as you say, of both the House and Senate Education Committees. And I'm sure that the committees, in fact, I know that the committees have taken testimony from other school boards in Vermont about Act 46. But it seemed interesting to me that three of those folks made the pilgrimage up there and really spent all day talking to those lawmakers about why they think they need more time and more clarity on Act 46 before they can really make some really big decisions about the future of education in that town.
Well, yeah, because you say in your story, they argue that Marlboro is not alone in this dilemma. So I would imagine that there would have been other school board members from other communities in that dilemma also giving testimony. Is that rare? To me, it seems rare that one entity would be giving testimony on an issue on a given day.
I think, I was just talking with some folks at VTDigger yesterday, and there are some other school boards this week talking about this very same issue. I think what Marlboro said was they were trying to speak not only for themselves, but for other districts that feel like they're, the odd man out in Act 46. Like they don't have easy partners to find for mergers and didn't have enough time really to figure out, so what do we do? They kept using the phrase, we can't find a dance partner.
Yeah. And I certainly appreciate the work that you and Chris Mays at the Reformer have done in trying to explain some of these Act 46 study committees and some of the things we're grappling with, because it's very complicated to wrap one's heads around. It seems especially complicated here. You have Windham Central Supervisory Union, which has all these little schools. Have they made it more difficult on themselves? When I read that they have two study committees looking at basically the same thing, it's kind of like having a side-by-side study committee to do a side-by-side plan. Is there interaction between these two different study committees in the Central Supervisory Union?
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that was built into Act 46 was, if they meaning the legislature would have said all supervisory unions in Vermont simply have to merge into one district, that never would have worked. And Windham Central is probably a good example of that. There's something like 11 or 12 school boards. You have a town, Stratton, actually, that doesn't even have a school. You have some towns that do, their own elementaries and then funnel into Leland and Gray. You've got towns, in this case, like Marlboro, the only town that does a K through 8.
Right.
And so what they set up was this side-by-side merger where the Leland and Gray towns are considering getting together. There's 5 of those, and they would do a K through 12 district. And then the other side of that side-by-side would be Dover, Marlboro, and Wardsboro would join into, in this case, a K through 6 district with school choice thereafter.
For any of the middle school or upper high school level things. And that really is the ultimate goal for Marlboro, is to keep that 7th and 8th grade, right? I mean, that's what they're hoping for here.
Well, that's the issue, and that's what made it such an interesting day of testimony, because on one hand, they've committed to this town meeting day vote of joining this new K through 6 district with Dover and Wardsboro. On the other hand, they're saying, gee, what that means is we'll have to give up our middle school, because what the state has said is you can't have individual towns within the same merged district offering different versions of school choice. Everybody's got to be on the same page.
Yeah. Did the House or Senate education committees feel sympathetic? Did you get a sense? You were there in the room during this testimony. What was this reaction from the lawmakers?
Well, very small rooms, I would add. It's
We're
an
a cozy little community
interesting
here.
environment up there. Everybody's sort of pinned against the wall listening to these hours of testimony. But I think there was sympathy for Marlboro's dilemma, especially their geographical dilemma. One of the members of the House Education Committee is from Shaftesbury, is very familiar with Route 9 and the geography of the area. On the other hand, I didn't hear anybody say, gee, this sounds great, we're going to give you more time. And one of the interesting dynamics that was happening that day in House Education Committee was immediately after Marlboro said, we want more time, there were other officials from Windham Central Supervisory Union who stepped up to that same committee and said, if you give more time, you shouldn't give it to everybody because it's not fair to those of us who have done a ton of work already on Act 46.
Yeah. Well, and let's be honest here. Any amount of time isn't necessarily going to generate the outcome that Marlboro wants. Marlboro wants their 7th and 8th grade. Right or wrong, I'm not making a judgment on whether they should or shouldn't maintain this 7th or 8th grade, although it is interesting to hear that one of the school board members talked about steady enrollment. Mm-hmm. I don't know if they defined what steady enrollment is.
Yeah, they said they're roughly around 80 to 85 students K through 8 for the last dozen or so years.
Yeah, and also interested to hear if we know the costs for Marlboro in terms of the whole Act 60, 68 with phantom students and all these equalized student ratios. You know, they're probably benefiting from the largesse of some of these other towns pretty greatly. I don't know if that came up in the testimony.
There wasn't a lot of talk about cost. What there was talk about was, well, gee, why didn't you look into partnering with Brattleboro?
Right.
But the problem there is that Marlboro wants to retain its 7th and 8th grade, but they also want to retain high school choice, which they couldn't do if they got involved with the Brattleboro districts.
Yeah.
I mean, what the Marlboro folks are saying is, you say in Act 46, you, the legislature, that there's this room for alternative structures, other kinds of mergers that schools can do, but you haven't really clearly defined what those are. And so how in the world are we supposed to come up with an alternative plan if you haven't told us how that should work? And that's a legitimate criticism.
It is, and that's why there is legitimate legislation going through. I believe the House, Mike Hebert introduced the legislation asking for an extension on Act 46. But again, I don't see any extension resulting in the outcome that Marlboro wants with the 7th and 8th grade being preserved. But certainly an interesting conversation. People can read about it in the Friday edition of the Brattleboro Reformer. It's online at reformer.com under the byline of Mike Faher. Lots of other stories with Mike's byline as well, both in the Reformer as well as the Commons, and they all originate at VTDigger.org. More with Mike Faher after the bottom of the hour news break here on Green Mountain Mornings. 14 degrees outside at 21 minutes before the 9 o'clock hour. Green Mountain Mornings continuing now. Your host, Chris Lenois, and Mike Faher, the reporter for VTDigger. VTDigger.org is where the stories originate, and they're also published in the Brattleboro Reformer as well as the Commons. Always happy to have Mike in here every other week, alternating with Chris Mays to talk about some of the stories he's covering. Last time you were in here, we were talking, Mike, about the Nuclear Regulatory Commission planned meeting down at their headquarters in Maryland and the lack of a local meeting regarding the sale of the Vermont Yankee nuclear reactor down in Vernon from Entergy to the North Star Group. That meeting has happened. You participated in it by telephone, right? You didn't go down to the Mid-Atlantic and do that. And a lot of other people, it seems, participated as well. You quote Deb Katz, from the Citizens Awareness Network as participating as well as some other people. The ideal plan here, what's the ideal? We'll get to all the extraneous aspects afterwards, but basically, what does North Star and Entergy want to happen when they are appealing to the NRC to approve this?
Well, one of the interesting things that came out of the NRC meeting was they sort of set forth their ideal time frame. They said to the NRC, look, we want you to approve this license transfer at Vermont Yankee to us by the end of 2017, which sounds like a long time, but by NRC standards, it's really not.
Yeah, 2018.
Well, they want NRC approval by the end of 2017.
By 2017 and closing 2018.
Exactly,
right.
So that they can buy the plant by the end of 2018. And they're also telling the state that, because the state has to approve this sale as well, they want the state to approve it by the first quarter of 2018. So basically, they want both the federal and the state governments to sign off on this long before the actual close of the deal. And the reason is that they're saying we can actually get started with decommissioning even earlier than we promised if we know that this is going to happen and we can start a lot of detailed planning and engineering work in advance of the sale closure.
Right. And you have another story that kind of also alludes to this that we'll get into a minute. The realities of this ideal happening. There are obstacles in the way with the state. There are obstacles in the way with actually doing the work to get it done, right?
Well, it's everybody's sort of, I should say at this point that I haven't heard anybody in the state or federal government say we don't think these timelines are realistic. There's a meeting this week at the Public Service Board to sort of set a schedule for this process. And the order that comes out of that meeting will be kind of interesting to see whether the Public Service Board thinks that Entergy and North Star's timelines are realistic. I should note that it took them, I think, a year or more than a year. I say the state. It took the state more than a year to approve a concrete pad at Vermont Yankee to store the fuel. So it could be that the sale of the plant takes a little longer than that.
Mm-hmm. With regards to some of the groups that have raised a question about why this is being fast-tracked, most notably the Citizens Awareness Network and their comments during this meeting and some of the assurances they were given. Talk a little bit about some of the ways that North Star Group said, we're qualified to do this, because that was basically what they had to answer from some of the skeptics.
Yeah, every time that North Star has appeared at a meeting in the past several months since this deal was announced, they've made a point of talking about their own experience in demolishing power plants. Admittedly, a lot of that experience is in fossil fuel plants,
right?
But very large fossil fuel plants. But they've also talked about the experience of their partners, primarily Areva, which is a Paris-based company that apparently specializes in taking apart nuclear reactors and has done this all over the world. They've also talked a lot about their finances and about the trust fund and about their cost estimates, which we've seen sort of trickling out as these regulatory filings are made.
Right. And Scott State saying, the person who leads North Star, the chief executive officer, Scott State, saying that we're not here to cut corners, which has certainly been one of the concerns raised by some of the people like Deb Katz and people like that. I did find it interesting because you and I have had these conversations. I had these conversations with people. It's like the projections for Entergy to do the decommissioning was so much more.
Yeah.
And you have North Star saying they can do it for what's in the decommissioning fund now, which is at least half of what Entergy projected. Now we know why from this story, because it doesn't include fuel management costs.
Yeah, without getting too far into the weeds, that spent fuel is going to sit at Vermont Yankee, even by the most optimistic projections, until the 2050s. And there's got to be money to manage it, secure it, round-the-clock security for this stuff. And what North Star is saying is, well, instead of the I want to say it was $200 and some million that Entergy had projected for spent fuel management. We're only allocating something like $20 million, and the reason is they think that they're going to get a regular allocation from the federal government to cover those costs.
Right. Yeah. There's and this is also plays into the other story that you had about this about the spent fuel pool transfer already getting going. You had that story in Monday's Brattleboro Reformer. It's almost like they don't consider the fuel management part of the decommissioning. And I see some logic to that, quite honestly, when you think about that's part two, right? You decommission the plant, and then obviously this stuff is going to sit there for a long time. It's a sensible removal, but it does explain a lot about the math.
It does. I mean, the interesting thing is that other companies, including Entergy, have already recovered money from the federal government. The federal government had a statutory obligation to find a central repository somewhere for this stuff and move it. They haven't done it, and so all these nuclear companies just sue them and recover money from the federal government. So,
and the fascinating part of that, and this is getting to your story on Monday about the spent fuel pools on the move, although not moving too far, basically from one part of the plant lot to another part of the plant. Entergy hasn't even been using the decommissioning fund for the cost of this. They've been basically getting lines of credit and then suing the federal government for the money. So that basically any money that's been withdrawn from the decommissioning fund by Entergy so far, I would say for the most part, hasn't been towards decommissioning.
Well, it hasn't been toward the spent fuel.
That's for sure.
I mean, and it underscores that idea that you can successfully sue the federal government, because Entergy to move all of Vermont Yankee's fuel from the spent fuel pool into these sealed casks, they took out a $145 million line of credit, basically a loan, and they intend for that to be repaid by suing the federal government.
Yeah. Now, the two questions left from these two stories and the latest meeting here. Number one, will there be a meeting in Vermont somewhere? That was raised during the phone conversation. Did the NRC seem amenable to it?
The NRC is hard to figure out. You know, they don't. They're really good bureaucrats, and I don't mean that as a an insult. But they don't sort of tip their hand in that regard. At the VTDigger meeting in Brattleboro on Thursday, the advisory panel voted to send a letter to the NRC, really saying we want a public meeting on this sale somewhere in southern Vermont. We think there should be one. That said, apparently the NRC is not obligated to grant that.
Okay. And then the other question, if North Star doesn't get what they want in terms of timelines for this, is there a chance they back out of this deal?
That question has been raised, and they haven't said for sure one way or the other, but the indication that I got was that there's some wiggle room here, as there would be in any proposal, but maybe not a lot. And I would guess if this drags on for a really long time, it could jeopardize the deal. That being said, somebody from a representative of the State Public Service Department, different from the board, the department advocates for the public on these energy issues, said at this meeting in Brattleboro on Thursday, this process is going to take, from our perspective, as long as it needs to take, to make sure we're doing a thorough review.
Yeah, because I mean, up until it closes, I'm sure there are clauses, agreements in whatever they have as far as a purchase and sale agreement or whatever it takes to buy a nuclear power plant. That listen, if we don't get these mile markers or these milestones, we're not going to go through with the sale. And I'm sure that they've put forth the ideal, but I wonder what that wiggle room is. It sounds like at least they aren't saying take it or leave it at the get-go.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. Now you have another story. It's not hit the Reformer yet or the Commons, but it is in this morning's Digger, having to do with the Citizens Advisory Panel here and a change in representation on that. Give us some background on that.
Yeah, there are 19 members on that panel, and Kate O'Connor, the chair, is proposing a reshuffling in order to add more Windham County legislators. The result of that reshuffling, though, is that there's this longtime state lawmaker named Mark McDonald. He's a senator from the Orange District, and he's also a longtime VY activist. He was involved in VSNAP. You remember that panel? Mm-hmm. And he would be gone from the advisory panel as we now know it. And Mark's not happy about that.
Well, is he the only lawmaker from outside of Windham County on the?
Well, there's a Massachusetts lawmaker on there as well, but as far as Vermont, yes.
Yeah. So, yeah. I mean, that's a voice, right? I mean, when you're talking about the makeup of who has say in something like this is not just a Windham County issue, that's why they've invited people from New Hampshire and Massachusetts. It is a state issue. So I could see where he is upset, especially because they're not replacing him with another non-Windham County lawmaker.
Right. The word he used is they want somebody more provincial, which I know Kate didn't take kindly to that term. She has a legitimate point when she says we don't have Vermont lawmakers showing up enough to these meetings, and basically that's where she's going with this. We need our legislators here, and we need them, especially now with this plant sale pending, to be involved with this panel, and we need them then to take our concerns back to Montpelier.
And so when Kate is saying Vermont lawmaker, she's not saying Windham County lawmaker. She wants people like him from other parts of the state.
Well, no, I mean, her proposal would be all 3 Vermont lawmakers on this panel would now be from Windham County.
Oh, okay.
But what she's hoping is that if we have folks based in Windham County, that we can then have more people showing up rather than folks coming from the northern part of the state. Yeah. And also, I guess you could make the argument if they're from Windham County, maybe they know these issues a little better. They know the constituents, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's the inside versus outside perspective and what really benefits a panel like that, but certainly something to pay attention to. We're just about out of time here. Other things you've got coming up with your byline, Mike?
Yeah, I'm hoping to interview the new commander of the State Police Barracks in Westminster. They just named a new supervisor up there this week. Maybe talk to him about some law enforcement issues.
All right. Well, we'll probably talk to you about that in a couple weeks. Thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Mike Faher, reporter for VTDigger, as well as the Reformer and the Commons. Always appreciate him coming in and sharing his perspective on local stories. We'll be back to wrap up this edition of Green Mountain Mornings right after these messages.